Welcome everyone to How the Authors View ISO 9001-2015 webinar. This webinar is going to feature an interview with Peter Merrill, who's a member of ISO TC 176 WG23, the Communications Group of Technical Committee TC 176, who are the authors of the ISO 9001-2015 standard. Just to give you an idea of how today's webinar is going to go, we do have a bank of predetermined questions for Peter. We also gave the ability for people that are registered to the webinar to put in some burning questions, and we have a couple of those. If we have time before the end of the webinar at 2:30, we're going to take a look at whatever chat questions might have come in and see how many of those we could answer. But we're definitely going to look at keeping to the time, 1 hour webinar from 1:30 to 2:30. So I'll get right into the questions with Peter Merrill. And what I'll do is I'll start off with asking Peter if you can elaborate on the communications group that you're a part of, and what its responsibilities were relating to the standard and the technical committee that were the authors of the ISO 9001 standard. Peter?
So Working Group 23 is, as you indicated, Michael, the communications group for Technical Committee 176. And our job has been to take the standard and put it into everyday language. The standard, because of its very nature, is written in a legalese kind of form. And we have taken that and interpreted it not in a, so we say, strict technical sense, but really in a guidance sense to help people. We've created things like a list of frequently asked questions. We've created white papers on key topics like documentation and so forth. So that's the job of Working Group 23.
So really what your group was responsible for was to take the actual author's work and be able to communicate it to the public.
Exactly.
Okay, and in doing so, you had to think about, okay, what is it that they really meant with this, and what is the message that they wanted to give to everyone?
Yeah, and a good example would be documentation. All the documentation issues are dispersed right through the 6,000 words of the standard. And so if a person's asking about documentation, what we've done is extracted the key points about documentation from right through the standard and condensed it into a one-page document.
Okay. So going on, the new, just getting right into the new version of the standard itself, the new 2015 version here is going to be released September 23rd this year. It's going to be actually published on September 23rd. And it will most likely be the version that organizations currently thinking about implementing for the first time will become certified to. But how long do already certified organizations have to change over to the new version?
Well, the press release, which came out a couple of days ago, and which gives us September 23rd as the date, gives all companies then 3 years in order to transition to the new standard. So the 23rd of September 2018 will be the deadline. And after that date, so the 23rd of September 2018, all registrations to the 2008 standard will cease to be valid.
Okay, so that's pretty simple. You have 3 years from the date of publication of the new version of the standard for that to be able to use earlier versions. But after 3 years, that's it. Not a day more after the day after the 3 years. You better be working to the new standard.
Yeah.
Now here's a question: what if an organization is almost ready to become certified, but you know it's over 2015, it's been kind of a mystery as to when it was going to come out. So you can imagine that if they didn't have the information of what the new standard looked like, they were implementing to still the old standard, 2008 version. So what if an organization is almost ready to become certified to the 2008 version, but not until after ISO 9001 2015 is published, like after the September 23rd?
Well, in that kind of situation, they've got two choices. The simple choice is to carry on and register to the 2008 standard, but recognize that they probably need to start working over the next couple of years in transitioning to the new standard. And one of the guidance documents that our working group 23, has produced is a correlation matrix, which shows which clauses in the old standard fit against which clauses in the new standard. They cross-reference the clauses. So that's there to help. But the other issue that a company say it's targeting for registration in November, December of this year, and I'd say, well, don't change horses when you've nearly crossed the stream. Stay on the horse you're on. You do need at the same time to be thinking about, well, what do we need to do with the new standard? If a company's only just started looking at the 2008 standard, I would strongly recommend them looking at the new standard and embracing the additional requirements of the new standard. It'll save doing the job twice.
Okay, I think you're referring to the fact that with any certification, there's a 3-year period. And after 3 years, you have to recertify, which is a full certification on it again.
Yeah.
And so, although if I wanted to, I could become certified anytime within the 3 years after this September 23rd to the 2008 version of the standard, anytime. But come September 23rd, 2018, I would have to make sure that I was certified to the new standard. And that means a full certification audit.
Yep.
So in other words, to take advantage of only having to do a full certification audit once every 3 years, they should really be looking at the 2015 version today.
Yes.
Okay. Along with that, you mentioned that there was some support from the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. Is there any other items that you want to bring up that we can expect, support that we can expect from ISO?
Well, the primary documentation that Working Group 23 has developed are the frequently asked questions, which I mentioned. There's probably about 30-something of those. The correlation matrix, which cross-references the clauses in the old standard with the new. A white paper on documentation, a white paper on risk-based thinking, and I'm very specific in calling it risk-based thinking. It's not risk management. It's the thinking behind the standard. And that paper has also had integrated into it elements of the process approach. And that's not new. The process approach actually was launched with the year 2000 version of the standard. So those are examples of white papers that have been developed to support the transition.
Okay, and I would imagine people could just go to www.iso.ch, I believe it is, and just search around there for any support for the new ISO 9001 standard. They should be able to find these white papers.
It's actually iso.org.
It's iso.org now? Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
iso.org. And they'll see very quickly. And actually, if you go via Google, it'll give you a broader choice in terms of entry points. That's usually the way I tend to go in, actually.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Now, before we go any further on from this question, there were a couple of burning questions that were put in by attendees at the time that they registered. So I just want to bring them up because they're kind of related to what we just asked. Number one is from Roy. Roy asked the question, we're currently registered to ISO 9001-2008 and the automotive version, ISO TS 16949. And our re-registration date is April 2016, so that's next spring. Can we register to these existing ISO editions this time and then re-register to ISO 9001-2015 and the corresponding automotive version 3 years after the publication date by December 2018? Or must we register to ISO 9001-2015 as soon as this current ISO 9001 registration expires next spring? Okay. So, Peter, I'll let you answer that one. So the question is, do they have to register to ISO 9001-2015 next spring when their current registration expires?
The short answer is no, they do not have to. However, it's important to recognize that their registration to the 2008 standard or re-registration in April 2016 will expire less than 3 years from that re-registration, because it will expire on the 23rd of September 2018. So that registration will be good for 2 years and about 8 months. Now, the other issue they're dealing with is TS 16949. And the automotive sector has been very late out of the blocks in terms of transitioning. Other sectors like aerospace are well down the road, and they're not going to be much longer before they're issuing their updated version of their standard. But the automotive guys have only just started, so I do not know, and I'm not sure they've got a firm time yet. They probably have, but it's certainly unlikely that they would have that available by April of 2016. So it looks for this particular company as though they will have to re-register to the 2008 standard, but that they will be faced with upgrading to the 2015 9001 and re-registering in less than 3 years.
Okay, so it's sort of like, yes, you can, but if you really want to be efficient with the whole 3-year cycle of certification, you might want to look at trying to go for the 2015 version next spring.
If they've got the resources to do it by that time, yes.
Okay, I just want to bring up the second burning question that was put forward by one of the attendees. This one is from Rob. Rob states, we're already registered to ISO 9001-2008 and the medical device version ISO 13485-2003. What do we need to do differently to comply with ISO 9001-2015?
Okay, this is a very broad question, so I'm really just going to flag the key differences between the old and new standard. And as we go through this interview, you'll be asking me questions, Michael, about those key differences. So I won't go deep on those issues right now.
Sounds good.
The first big difference is the new structure, the high-level structure of the standard. And this has been developed by bringing together technical committees on a wide range of management systems, such as environmental, health and safety, information technology. And we've all agreed on a common structure. That really helps companies that have got multiple standards. And a good example, of course, is TS 16949. When that is restructured, it'll fit exactly with 9001. The second big difference is the inclusion of services. The new standard doesn't just say product and have a footnote which says, oh, where you read the word product, you can use the word services. It now says product and services. So it does mean companies have to think about the service support they provide if they are a manufacturer. And that support may be consulting support, not just talking after sales service. Um, the major difference that I see, though, is the inclusion of the word context. And we're going to talk more about that in a little while. And that draws the company into thinking about strategic planning. The other major difference that I see is the introduction of risk-based thinking. And that ties very closely to the context issue. Probably, there's a couple of more things. Documentation has always been the nightmare of the standard. And there is a critical change in wording where the words documents and records are replaced with documented information. So that is endeavoring to get people thinking information rather than documents, because we've tended to be locked into that document thinking. And then finally, the one other major change, and again, it's more about thinking than doing, is that the title management representative has been removed. The job has not gone. All of the things that the management rep has done are still there. But the title has gone because it is an archaic title. It goes back to the days when the standard was not a quality management standard, but was a quality assurance standard. And it's a bit of a bolt-on kind of title. And so I've always said it's a very similar role to the financial controller, and a company should think about it in that sort of context. So whether it's the quality manager, the quality lead, or whatever you want to call that person, a lot of companies will probably keep the title management representative anyway. I hope that kind of gives you a concise sense of what's different.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate it. And Roy and Rob, I hope that those answered your burning questions. We're just going to go on to the next one. And that is just to take a short minute to ask Peter about the new standards layouts, because you were talking about earlier about things fitting together. So the thing is, the new version of the standard, the requirements are organized vastly different from the 2008 version, and also increasing the number of requirement sections from 5 to 8, adding features, moving things around. Where's this new layout coming from and why?
Okay, well, I touched on that a moment ago. Let me expand on it a bit now. One of the external pressures, marketplace pressures that we've been experiencing in ISO is people saying to us, look, I use a number of ISO standards and they're all structured differently. It makes it much more difficult for us. Why can't we integrate our management systems? So that pressure has been there for a long time, probably 15 or more years. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, ISO brought together key people from a wide range of technical committees and said, okay, let's look at a common structure that all the technical committees can use, and then enable the users of the standard, particularly if they use multiple standards, to integrate their management systems. Now, that was as a result of a simple request. There were a lot of benefits came from that, because there was a lot of cross-learning then between the different management systems. And for example, the quality management system people learned a lot from the environmental management system people, and vice versa, and so on. So a lot of the structural changes come as a result of that, consolidating into a common structure.
Thank you, Peter. That kind of clarifies a little bit of the reasoning why the standard looks like it is, even though there is, at this point in time, there's historically anyway, a big change coming. I'd like to just talk about for a moment right now scope of an organization. This is not necessarily anything different from previous versions of the standard, but I'd like to bring up the subject. Organizations may have different motivations for implementing and becoming certified to the ISO 9001 standard. So Could you talk to me about the different options they have to determine the scope of their quality management system?
Yeah. And you use the word history, and there's a lot of history attached to this. And it goes right back to 1987 when the standard was first written. And we had back then three versions: 9001, 9002, and 9003. And 9001 included design, 9002 excluded design. And all through the 90s, it became that sort of big division of, are you doing design or not? In the year 2000, we created an integrated standard where 9001, 2, and 3 all came together into one document. And people were at the same time given the option that in the section called product realization, they could say, this clause does not apply to me. And of course, the common exception was design. And at the same time, registrars charged more if people had design as part of their quality management system. So again, the divide remained. Although within clause 7, there were other sections that might not apply. For instance, if a company did not use calibrated instruments, clause 7.6 on measuring devices, they would claim an exclusion. And there were other areas. Surprisingly, there are companies who are able to exclude purchasing. A few, but it was there. Now, the wording has changed. And where I want to go here, Michael, and you'll see me looking away from you at the moment, I'm looking up at my other screen because I've pulled up the exact wording of the new standard. And I want to go through that because it's really important. It gives people exactly what they can and cannot do on scope. And this is, for the reference of any listener, it is clause 4.3 of the new standard, and it is the very last paragraph of clause 4.3. And it's a classic lawyer's sentence. So I'm going to break it out in order to try and convey the understanding of what it says. It's well over 3 lines. I'm not sure how many words, but anyway, here we go. I will also do a little bit of abbreviating of the wording in order to maintain the flow. So, conformity to the standard may only be claimed if the requirements determined as not applicable do not affect the ability to ensure conformity of products and services. So it's a kind of double negative kind of thing, which really throws the reader. So I'm going to go to the core words, which say conformity can only be claimed if requirements determined as not applicable do not affect the ability to ensure conformity. So if you say, I claim that I do not do design, you have to be able to show that design has no impact on what you deliver to your customer. If, on the other hand, there is a design component in what you deliver to your customer, that has to be addressed in the standard. And there are a number of companies that are in a kind of gray area, a sort of no man's land. And that's often where the debate comes. And a company that I've worked with in the past works in advanced materials. And what they do is they take a component from their customer, which is a steel or aluminium component, and they convert it into a carbon fiber component. Yes, they use the design specification of the customer. However, they are doing reconfiguration, and I would expect an auditor to say, actually, this is design, because the customer is dependent on your ability to configure the new component to their requirements. If, on the other hand, the customer gives the entire design, the drawings, everything to the supplier, and the supplier simply makes something to that specification, the supplier is not designing the product. A complex thing, but hopefully I've conveyed where the differences are there.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That gives people a little bit of an idea of how to handle what used to be called exclusions and now is just called whether or not you actually do the function or whether you don't. It used to be contained in what was called Section 7 of the current standard, the current version of the standard. Would you say that it could be attributed to all of Section 8 in this new standard?
And there may be other areas.
Okay.
That would primarily be Section 8 that people will say that a clause is not applicable.
Okay, so it's a matter of perhaps if it's outside of Section 8, perhaps letting their auditor know ahead of time so that they don't have any, there's no issues with it when it comes time for certification.
I think that in all cases, there's likely to be discussion with the auditor and prior agreement on scope. That happens today. So the exclusion word we used to use has now been replaced with the word scope. And that's a good way of looking at it. Scope is what every auditor will ask and agree in advance of the audit.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. I'd like to bring up the elephant in the room as far as one of the newest, strangest things to be put into the new standard. And this is understanding the context of the organization. This is vastly different from any approach from before, even though I think it has been traveling in this direction. Can you talk to us about what the authors meant when they put in the requirement for the organization to understand the context in which it operates?
Yeah, and this is a good example of where one of the other standards, specifically the environmental standard, started to influence the quality standard. In the environmental world, well, they are very concerned about the world outside of the organization, whereas the quality world tends to be more concerned about what's going on inside the organization. That's a dangerous thing for me to say, but I think people understand where I'm coming from there. However, if an organization is only inward looking, it is a very dangerous path to tread. Good organizations look outside. And that's what context is introducing. It's saying, what are the external influences, first of all, that affect you doing business? And they can be a wide range of things. New legislation, the exchange rate for Canadians manufacturers, that's a big issue right now. And issues like general economics, the price of oil, things like that. All of these factors affect the way an organization does business. And I've actually worked with 3 or 4 quite different businesses in the course of this year, using first the DIS and then the FDIS. And it's been actually quite exciting as we've worked through this context issue. And it really draws in the business leaders. So for the quality manager who's been having trouble engaging the leaders, this is going to do it for them, because it draws the standard into strategic planning. And so having determined the external issues that affect the business, they then need to be prioritized. Which is the most important? And very interesting, one of the companies found their primary issue was the labor market and finding skilled people. And that really, it kind of reinforced what they intuitively know, but now it's got their quality management system really focused on that issue. The other aspect of context is the internal issues. What are the issues like culture and so on that affect you? And again, getting us looking at a risk assessment. And it's important to think system, because clause 4, where context is, links through to clause 6, which is planning, and where we start to address risk and opportunity. Having identified the risks in clause 4, we need to prioritize them in clause 6. And for most quality managers, that's pretty standard stuff. It's a failure mode and effect analysis, again, where you prioritize your risks. And I'm kind of stepping into the area of risk assessment, which I know we're going to talk about a bit later, Michael. But I'll just say briefly, having identified where your risk is, you don't just stop at that. And I'll leave it there for the moment and wait until you raise the question of risk-based thinking.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That sounds an awful lot, when you talk about strategic planning and risk assessment, it sounds an awful lot like you know, a fairly traditional process that many organizations use for their strategic planning now. And that is an environmental scan, for example,
Yep.
for them to pull in information to be able to define the context, and the SWOT analysis, the good old SWOT analysis, which is a vehicle that they might actually be able to use to start defining or prioritizing risk.
Exactly.
But like you said, we're going to talk about risk analysis later. But before we do that, the next question is about 4.2 of the standard. It requires that the organization understand the needs and expectation of interested parties. So first, what does it mean by interested parties?
Well, this is broadening the thinking of a quality system beyond just the customer. What it's getting people to think about is, what are the other parties that affect the performance of your quality management system? And obviously, a major interested party is your suppliers. They want you to succeed. And so understanding our suppliers is already part of the 2008 standard, when you look at the 8 principles on which the existing standard is based. Then, when you look at, sorry, I've lost the thread again, a second, Michael. There was a little bit of external noise coming in there. So beyond suppliers, we've got people like our employees. They are also very interested in the success of the business, as you might expect. They may also, in a regulated industry, be legislators and regulators who are interested in how the organization functions. So what this is doing is saying, be mindful of who has an interest in the success of your business and relate to those people. Don't just exclude them and blank them out from your quality management system.
That almost, again, that almost sounds like what could be referred to as stakeholders,
Yes.
which is common language. Now, again, going a little bit further into that question I just asked, it also talked about needs and expectations, and a funny, kind of an interesting comments that I read in the standard. I mean, it's always talked about requirements, but now it talks about needs and expectations. And there's almost a spot where it seems to link requirements and needs and expectations all together and call them the same thing. What's your view on that?
Well, the definition of requirements includes the identification of needs and expectations. So if you look at the life cycle of arriving at an agreement with a customer, we start off by talking to the customer as to what are their needs. We then agree with the customer which of those needs we can meet. And typically we can't meet all of them. We probably find that there are some of their needs that are outside of our capability. So then we have an agreement. And once we've arrived at agreement, then quality is about conformance to requirements, agreed requirements. Nevertheless, the customer has certain expectations and expects us to conform to requirements. So that's really the flow of needs, requirements, and expectations.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for clarifying that. I just want to go on right now. I see that, you know, we only have just over 20 minutes left in the webinar. So I just want to quickly go on to the next question. And this one has to do with documentation. Previous versions of the standard have progressively lessened the requirement for documentation, so to speak, until we find ourselves with the 2015 version. And it's almost, I mean, they don't talk that much about documentation. They talk about documented information, but it's almost as if procedures are not required at all. In fact, I've had someone approach me and ask me the question, does that mean that we don't need procedures anymore? So could you just talk a little bit about documentation in the new version?
And again, this is something that's tied into history. Back in the 90s, ISO 9000 was all about procedures, and it got a very bad reputation for being about mega documentation. And yet that was not the intention. The intention was to control processes. In the year 2000, we took away all of those procedure requirements, condensed them to 6 system level procedures, we call them. But still, the desire was about controlling processes. And so in the 2015 standard, we've done a couple of things. We have, and I mentioned this previously, dropped the word document and records. There was always a bit of agony around what the difference was there. And we've replaced them with the words documented information. And in a way, it would be nice if the word information was underlined, because that's what matters. It's about information flowing through the business. And throughout the 2015 standard, you'll see reference to documented information being maintained and documented information being retained. Where it uses the word maintained, it means that you need to maintain that information in order to run the business, run the management system. Similar to what we used to call documents. Where it says documented information retained, that is very similar to the records word that we used to have, but it's emphasizing that you keep information as evidence of whether a process is delivering the output that it requires. So retained information becomes extremely important in the new standard, and that's where the auditor is going to focus. One other thing that people have commented on is that the standard doesn't mention the need for a quality manual. In actual fact, it's rather like the management representative. The title has been removed, but all of the requirements that went into the manual of the 2008 standard are still there. We need to still define and document the boundaries of the QMS. We need to define the scope. We need to justify any requirement that's not applicable. And it then leaves it to the organization itself to decide what information is required to support operations, to describe the interaction of processes. So all of those things that a manual in the 2008 standard actually looked for are still there. It just doesn't use the word manual. And in fact, the environmental standard has never required a manual. It gives an organization more flexibility. The bottom line is that an organization, and this is a critical statement in clause 8.5, the organization must demonstrate that its processes operate in controlled conditions. And that's the issue, that processes are in control. Okay, that was quite a lot, Michael, and I hope I didn't give people indigestion, but I've tried to really spell out what the standard's looking for there.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And that pretty well clarifies. It should clarify it anyway. I mean, procedures are are still, you don't need to throw away all of your procedures. Procedures are still needed unless, of course, you have some other way to impart that information, that instructional information to people in your organization. But it gives a lot more flexibility. Now, here's what I think is a pertinent question as well, though, if we're going along that same vein of thought. I know that in earlier versions of the standard, they did talk about the process approach, but this version, it's becoming much more front and center. Can you talk just a little bit on the difference between the process approach and traditional procedures?
Well, the process approach I like to link into system thinking. And remember, we are operating a quality management system. And I'm going to quote one of the definitions that comes in the 9000 document, clause 3.4.1. The definition of system is a set of interrelated or interacting elements. Back in the 90s, people tended to think of processes on their own. Now we have to think of processes interrelating or interacting. So it's not just, is a process in control? Does the process link to the other processes that it should interrelate with or interact with? And are we getting a flow of information through the business? So the process approach is about ensuring that processes are in control, but also, and I've emphasized that a couple of times already, but also ensuring that processes link to the other processes that you should link to so that we get the system functioning. So I encourage people to explore and understand a little more what is meant by system thinking. And the 9000 document, which many people do not read, the 9000 documents got a lot of very useful information in that area.
Okay, and the ISO 9000 document is going to be published, I believe, the same date as the new 9001 version. Okay. So let's go to the other elephant in the room right now, the word risk and the whole risk assessment, risk and opportunities. The word risk in this version of the standard is, it's mentioned at least 16 times. But whenever I've talked to people about the requirement for a formal risk management system, it seems to be downplayed. Can you tell us a little bit about what the intent of the authors had concerning risk and opportunity?
And it's important to recognize that we do not use the word risk management. We say risk-based thinking. And there is a white paper, I mentioned that, which explains this. But risk-based thinking has always been there. It was just that in the 2000 standard and 2008, we never used that four-letter word. It was implicit, now it is explicit. And in fact, risk has been part of business management for the longest time. And when I started talking about context, I very quickly mentioned risk. External risk, when you do the external assessment of what affects your business. Internal risk, when you look at the internal processes and the risk of a process failing. So we do the internal and external risk assessment, prioritize our risks, and then we mitigate those risks. And we have to decide how are we going to mitigate those risks. In the old days, we said, oh, we'll just put in a procedure. And that was why, everybody has been so kind of intuitively locked into procedures. Now we have choices. If you look at the way business has developed over the last 15 years, we mitigate risk far, far more through technology. We use software, for instance, which has got stop signs. You cannot leave this screen until you've finished all of the boxes. That's an example of mitigating risk. We've also recognized that investing in our people and developing their competencies is another way of mitigating risk. So all of these things are what we do once we know where the risk is highest. So that risk thing flows from context in clause 4 through to risk and opportunity in clause 6, and then out through the standard as we control those processes where the risk is highest. And I've just explained, you don't have to put a procedure in. You can put in a checklist, you can strengthen your technology, you can increase your competencies. So risk is kind of the red thread that runs through the fabric of the standard.
That's a nice way of putting it, Peter. Thank you. Now, I just have one other predetermined question for Peter in this webinar. So while I'm asking that question and Peter is giving his answer, perhaps if the attendees have any questions of their own that hadn't been met during the webinar so far, they could use the chat to start bringing them up, because at the end of this last question, we'll see if we can't answer any of the chat questions before we formally end the webinar. So I'll leave it up to you. Peter, the last question I have is, there's been a lot of debate about the method of conducting internal audits, with seemingly different approaches being checklist-styled audits versus process-styled audits. Can you tell me if the authors had, or if ISO has any intent of selecting one over the other or requiring one over the other, and or whether or not they feel that there should be a combination of both? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got some fairly strong thoughts on this. Unfortunately, a lot of the audit training that is provided to people is provided by people who only do external audits. And that's one of the realities. You know, the registrars provide that training. And external audits are different from internal audits. First of all, they're conducted by people who spend their lives doing audits. A typical internal auditor will probably conduct an audit once or twice a year. And so they don't have the exposure to auditing practices. ISO does have a guidance document, 19,011. ISO 19,011 provides guidance on internal auditing, but even then, it doesn't address that question that you've just raised, Michael. The difference between, what should we call it, the checklist approach versus process audits. And I think my very first job 15 years ago in ISO was on terms and definitions. So I've been cursed with that thinking ever since. I'm going to have to interpret those two terms. The checklist approach tends to be a term used for the generic checklist derived from the requirements of the standard. That's where that term tends to be used. And that has little use for an internal auditor. However, ultimately, we do have to show that we have met all of the requirements in the standard. So the process approach is about using our processes as the focus points for our internal audit. And there's another adage: you audit where there is risk. You always focus your audit where the risk is highest. And so I always encourage people, when they're doing an internal audit, to do a risk assessment across the organization to find where they should focus their audit. And risk changes year on year. Don't use the same risk assessment every year. So then, once you know which processes you're going to focus on, you do actually use a checklist, but not that generic checklist derived from the standard. You use a checklist, and I call them interview sheets, really, in which you write out questions in advance that are about that process. What are the records that are kept for the process? If it's a documented process, you'll be able to pull those up in advance. what are the reference materials used for the process? What skills are needed to be able to operate the process? And looking at each step in the process, do we know whether the output from that step is meeting the requirements for the process? And so a checklist is a good practice, but a customized checklist to a given process rather than a checklist derived from the standard. I hope that hasn't confused things too much. Does that give a better sense of those two things? You might have a supplementary question on that, Michael.
No, that kind of flows in with last week when we talked to the auditors about checklists and process approach and everything like that. I mean, the big thing is checklists have their pros and cons, and the process approach has its pros and cons. So like you said, it's important to have a checklist because you want to make sure that you don't miss anything, especially when you're doing internal audits and there may be a lot of people that they just don't audit every day of their life. So a checklist is nice to be able to bring us back to, okay, what was it that we were thinking of? But the whole idea behind the checklist is not to ask the question and expect an answer to that particular question. It's to ask the question of yourself and to start looking for evidence that that is so. Yeah. And the evidence could take you into different places. So it's an interesting question, but I'm glad that people have stated that there is a place for a checklist approach. There's also a place for the process approach. And perhaps if they were done in a combined method, that might be the best for organizations. Mm-hmm. So I haven't seen, that's it for the predefined questions that we were going to ask. They're very similar to the questions that we asked the auditors last week. And the reason for that is we want to get an idea into the mind of what the authors thought of the new standard, and or what they were trying to convey, and how the auditors were interpreting it, so that all parties would be able to interpret it in the same way when crunch time came up. I mean, you do want to make sure that the way that you think of it, if you were in the organization trying to implement it, the way that you interpret it is going to be the same way as the auditors interpret it, which is going to be the same way as the authors meant for it to be interpreted. So I had asked the attendees if they did have any questions to put them up in using the chat feature earlier. There doesn't seem to be any, so I'm going to finalize the webinar. I'd like to let everyone know that if you missed the webinar last Friday, which is how the auditors view ISO 9001-2015, you can sign up for a replay, an edited replay. It's much shorter without any of the silences or whatever, by going to www.iso9001club.com. And on the main page there, you'll be able to see where you can actually access the replay. Actually, as I was talking, we do have a chat question that came up from Lisa. Peter, I'll ask this of you. Lisa says we were re-registered in January 2015. Our auditor has said that we are required to be certified to 2015 revision on January 2017 maintenance audit. Can we wait for our 3-year re-registration? So I guess a 3-year re-registration would be from January 2015 to January 2018.
Yes.
Peter?
There is no requirement that I'm aware of, and I have the document issued by the IAF, the International Auditing Federation. There is no requirement saying you have to move within 2 years. Some registrars may be encouraging that, and that's not a bad thing to do. But there is not a requirement, certainly not that I'm aware of, that you have to transition in 2 years. Having said that, there is a very strong case for it, because those people tuned in who were transitioning from the 94 standard in the year 2003 will recall that 80% of companies had still not transitioned 3 months before December 2003. So that last 3 months was total chaos. So I would not encourage you to leave it that late. And in fact, 2 years is a reasonable time to be thinking about transitioning. Now, if you want 2 years from 2015 and from today, you're probably looking at September 2017. And I don't know that you'll be breaking any requirements by re-registering then. And now, if your surveillance audit is in January, well, okay, January 2018. But it's really what your capability is.
I think it was actually their recertification audit was January 2018.
The recertification, I'd heard the word surveillance audit. If the recertification is January 2018, that would be a perfect fit for moving to the new standard.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Hopefully that answered your question, Lisa. We have time for one more question. We only have a couple of minutes left, and this is from Tonis. Tonis asks, are there any fundamental differences on CAPA in the new standard? CAPA meaning corrective action, preventative action.
Okay.
You have a smile on your face.
I live in a world of acronyms, and I thought, oh, which regulatory body are we talking about?
Well, I'm assuming it's corrective action, preventative action.
Yes, yes. And of course, the big difference is that preventive action has been removed. And preventive action was always in the wrong place. It was an afterthought. It was a Friday afternoon thing, you know, and it was always a struggle. If you think about prevention, prevention is at the start of the management system, not at the end. If you look at the environmental standard, one of the basic principles at the start of ISO 10014 is prevention of pollution. So in the 2015 version of 9001, prevention is addressed through risk. I didn't mention that. So thank you very much for the question, because risk and risk mitigation is in fact prevention in practice. And so what we do is we see where are our weaknesses, and by mitigating risk, we are actually acting preventively. So that's where the shift occurs there. Very important question, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, Tonis, for asking that question. It did sound very pertinent. It's now 2:30, which is the end of our webinar, how the authors view ISO 9001, 2015. Again, if you visit www.iso9001club.com, I'd say in about 3 days, you should be able to see a replay of this one if other people that you know weren't able to attend it. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees for attending. Thank you very much. And I would especially like to thank Peter Merrill for coming and answering the questions to allow us all to have a kind of an insight into how the authors of the standard were thinking. Peter, thank you very much for attending.
Michael, thank you. My pleasure.
Have a great day, everyone. We'll talk to you later. And that's it for how the authors view ISO 9001, 2015. We'll see you next time.